So as well as the terrific difference in the amount of tonal information between a RAW file and a JPEG file, we also have a similar difference in the amount of color information between a RAW file and a JPEG file. And in this particular image, it's a single image saved in camera as a RAW file and a JPEG at the same time. I've subsequently changed the Canon RAW file into a DNG once again. I'd like to show you within Adobe Camera Raw how we can utilize the terrific amount of color information available in a RAW file compared to that of the JPEG. So in order for us to open up a JPEG or a TIFF file for that matter into Adobe Camera Raw, we need to change the way Bridge and Camera Raw interact. Normally, if we were to just open up a JPEG file, it would go straight to Photoshop. So in order to get it to go to Camera Raw, we need to go to Edit, Camera Raw Preferences, and in the Preferences dialog box here, these are the default settings: JPEG and TIFF handling, JPEG disable, JPEG support. So in this configuration, opening up a JPEG would go straight to Photoshop. If we want to open it up into Camera Raw, we have two possibilities: automatically open JPEGs with settings. Now that only works if you've already worked on a JPEG in Adobe Camera Raw. It recognizes that it's been worked on and it will open it up again. If you haven't worked on it, you can go to automatically open all supported JPEGs. So every JPEG from now on will open via Camera Raw. You can always go back and say disable JPEG support if you don't want it. You can do the same thing for TIFFs if you are working on TIFF files. Select OK. So now select the RAW file, Shift, select the JPEG file, then Control R will open both images into Adobe Camera Raw. We can see this, we're working on 9.5.1 version. So there's the camera, and here are one or two of the settings that I took the picture in. Notice that it's taken at ISO 3200, which is quite high for this particular camera. There's going to be quite a bit of noise in it. Now I'd like to try and bring back some of the warmth that I remember in this image. The camera's set it at a fairly low temperature and it's given it a very blue cast, although a lot of the image is blue. But I'd like to bring back some of the warmth if I can, a bit of the red. So working on the RAW file, I'll make all the adjustments on the RAW file, and then I'll go to the little menu here and we'll have sync settings. So we'll be able to synchronize the settings with the JPEGs. So exactly the same processes will be applied to the JPEG as I've done to the RAW file. So we'll go to temperature and drag the slider to around about 20,000 or so. And you can see we've gone and brought back some of the warmth in certain areas. Okay. There are areas in here, Control Alt and 0 will magnify up to 100%. And we can just check down here, it's showing 100% here. These monitors here, I'm sure they've got information in them, and we can bring back information in the monitors by going to the highlight slider, and the highlight slider affects this area of the histogram here. So dragging the highlight slider to the left brings back a lot of that washed out light area. So probably something like that. We can have a look at the shadow areas and do a similar sort of thing to the shadows. So the shadow slider, drag that to the right, and that brings back detail into the shadow areas. And for quite a lot of images, this highlights to the left, shadows to the right is a kind of fixed thing that I often do, and it compresses the tonal range. So giving it almost a little HDR, high dynamic range kind of effect, but without the negative sort of processing attributes that you normally get. I'll just go back to full view, Control and 0. Now by doing those two sliders like that, we've reduced the overall exposure of the image. So I'm going to go to the exposure slider and drag that to about 1 or so, like that, just to bring back the brightness of the image. If we look at the histogram, there's no shadow clipping, there's no spike on the left, there's no highlight clipping, no spike on the right. So we can bring back, expand the tonal range. We could use the contrast, but I rarely use the contrast slider. So just double click to 0 that. I prefer to use these, which are far more accurate in the way they work. I'm going to press the Alt key whilst I do this, and as I drag the slider to the right, anything that's white means it's totally clipped in all 3 channels. We can see there's areas of green here, which means that the green channel's clipped. And as I drag it to the right, we've got reds and yellow. So the different colours means that they are pure colour. Okay, so we need to limit the amount of clipping, especially in the highlights. But there are certain things like these lamps that are supposed to be pure white. So I don't mind those being clipped. In fact, you need to have them clipped. So that's probably right. I'll try the black slider, Alt key, drag that to the left, and anything that's black is totally clipped. And you can watch the slider, the histogram here, big spike there. So Alt, drag that back. And for an image like this, I don't mind a bit of black in the image because it's supposed to be very dark. We've still got areas that need a bit of detail in them. We'll still retain the detail, but we've got a nice contrasty kind of image there. You might want to tweak the exposure just again after you've adjusted these sliders here. We're left with the clarity, vibrance and saturation. These are called the presence sliders. And the clarity slider is quite useful. If you drag it to the left, it gives you a very misty effect. But the clarity affects the tonal range in the midtones. And by dragging it to the right, you're increasing the tonal difference between adjacent pixels. Basically, you're sharpening the mid-tone values. And this produces quite a useful effect, and most pictures will benefit from a bit of clarity applied. Saturation. This boosts color across all 3 color channels or reduces it. It's a very blunt instrument, and I tend to, these days, put a little bit of negative saturation in and then compensate with a bit of vibrance, which is an intelligent saturation tool. It tends to bias the effect on areas that aren't all that colored in the first place. So it tends to leave the very saturated colors alone and just boosts the more milder colors. Okay, so something like that. Now, because this is a raw file, it hasn't had any noise reduction or sharpening applied to it. So unlike the JPEG, okay, which was all done in camera. So I'm going to go to the Detail tab, or the menu here. Just go to 100% again, Control Alt 0. Just find an area of even tone there. I'll just boost this to 200%. Just go down here, 200%. Now, before you do any sort of sharpening, and this would only be pre-sharpening, not final sharpening, which you would always do in Photoshop before you decide to print it or create a DPI image. But noise reduction needs to be handled first, and these are the default settings. There's no luminance applied, but there is a default setting of 25 color, and these are the settings here. Now, if I was to drag that to the left, you can see there's an awful lot of color noise, but the default setting, just double click that, gets rid of it. So I rarely need to change these color settings. The default settings get rid of virtually all your color noise. So we're left with luminance noise. This is brightness variations within tones that should be all the same. Now, if I drag the luminance slider to the right, we start to merge together these variations in tonal differences. Okay. Drag it fully to the right and you get rid of it all and it becomes like a plastic molding. So I found that I rarely take it over 40, maybe in this instance around about 35 or so, and that's given us a fairly decent noise reduction amount. Detail, this is a kind of suppression filter. Drag it to the left, it suppresses, well, it enhances the noise reduction. If you drag it to the right, you'll find that there's less luminance noise reduction applied. Okay, so it's a suppression filter. I tend to leave that the default, and the luminance contrast can be useful for certain types of image, but for this one I'm going to leave that at 0. Let's go back to the basic panel, Control 0, and now I want to apply, I've done everything I need to do to the raw file. I want to apply the same settings to the JPEG. So the raw file is selected, Shift, select the JPEG, go to our little menu here and sync settings, and that'll bring up this synchronize box here. Now all of the temperature, tint, exposure, contrast, you can see they're all down here. So I want all those applied to the JPEG file. I don't want sharpening, luminance, noise, color noise and that applying to the JPEG, because it was already done in camera. So if I was to have these selected, it would apply a double whammy to the JPEG file, which would be unfair for the assessment we're doing. We didn't apply any of these to the image, so it makes no odds whether they're ticked or not. So I'm going to select OK, and immediately we can see what has happened to the JPEG file. The reason it looks like this is because it didn't have sufficient color information and tonal information for the look at these monitors to apply the sweeping effects I wanted to apply, like we did in the raw file. It just didn't have the information there to do it. Also, so that one's selected, Shift click the JPEG. I'm going to go to Control Alt 0, spacebar, just bring it across here. So that's the raw file, and we can see, we can almost make out the words in there almost, and we can see the information in the monitors. I'm going to click on the JPEG file, and that's what we get there. Now we could bring it back from 1.35, just reduce that so we can get some sort of mid-tone. You can see here you can't make out anything there compared to, so even the definition, the resolution of the raw file is far superior to the JPEG captured in camera. This is mainly down to the fact that Adobe Camera Raw has advanced over the algorithms embedded in the camera. It's able to produce a far sharper image than the basic camera software was able to. So let's just go to the JPEG, bring it back to the 135 or so, what we had it there, and a final look at both images. So that's the JPEG and that's the raw. Okay, so hopefully you can see, even for an image like this, you know, sort of happy snapshot where I just want to make some fairly reasonable changes to an image, the potential what you've got with the raw file compared to what you haven't with the JPEG.